would like to welcome Mariska van der Horst and Professor Sarah Vickerstaff onto today's Mature Movers podcast. Mariska and Sarah have recently published some research together, posing the question, is part of ageism actually ableism? Mariska is a lecturer and assistant professor at VU University Amsterdam and an honorary researcher at the University of Kent. Mariska's special interests focus on older workers and disability. Sarah is a professor of work and employment at the University of Kent. And over the last 20 years, Sarah has delved into research focused on paid work in later life and retirement transitions. Both Sarah and Mariska have been involved in numerous research publications and have received high-level recognition for their work. Sarah is a keen gardener and aspires to have a massive greenhouse one day in her garden where she'll spend most of her time. And Mariska loves music and actually plays the flute. So I'm really looking forward to discussing their research, ageism and ableism within the workplace and much more on today's Mature Movers podcast. How did you guys meet and then decide to do this research project together?
We met because I applied for a job that Sarah advertised back in, when was this, 2014?
Probably.
I just came out from my PhD, and my PhD was about aspirations of men and women and the consequences of that for their careers. And around it, there was a lot of discussion around people needed to work longer as well. So I kind of wanted to move more towards older workers. And this position that Sarah advertised was about older workers and gender differences in that. So I applied for that and was very lucky to get it. So that's how we met.
Yes, that was a project on employers and older workers. And it was a number of case studies. And it was looking specifically, I've been doing that kind of research since the early part of this century. And this was specifically to look at how employers or whether employers had changed their practice, given that there'd been a lot of policy changes. So state pension age had gone up, age discrimination legislation had come in, mandatory retirement ages were going. So it seemed an opportune moment to sort of go and see whether we could detect major changes in how organisations were employing and managing older workers. And in particular, the key skills that Mariska brought to that project, because we also wanted to look at some of the quantitative data sets, was a great ability at quantitative research. So we were able also to look at the English longitudinal study of ageing and some of the trends in employment for older workers.
Brilliant.
She was the best candidate by a long way. So.
Oh, fantastic. What a compliment. So let's go back a little bit and look and talk about why individually as people you decided to focus on this route of research. Specifically, I know a lot of the work that Mariska you do is around labour, and maybe not always about ageing, but I know, Sarah, you're very interested in a lot of your current research has been focused on ageing. What kind of kick-started that triggering thought or passion to go down that route? Let's start with Mariska.
Like I said, for me, it started with getting out of my PhD, hearing a lot of the discussions around needing to work longer, and that was a lot in the media around that time as well. And I was interested in see whether gender differences that I looked at earlier on, how that then also played out around older workers. And that is why I applied for that position. And then I remained very much interested in that. So most of my research is still about older workers. And then when we got, I worked with Sarah on a couple of papers and others in the project there as well. And then towards the end of that, I started to read more about ageism as well. And I recognized a lot of that as maybe not being about age specifically, but more about ability, disability. So during a lunch, I pitched that to Sarah. What do you think about this? And she responded with, well, I buy that argument. So we wrote a research proposal for that together after that, and got further into that. And I'm still looking at similar topics as well now in a project that is headed by Edinburgh about supporting healthy aging at work. And very recently also now involved in a project in the Netherlands about health and older workers. So that's me.
Okay, for me, in the past, I'd done work on youth transitions into the labour market. So looking at the transition from school through education, college or apprenticeships into work. And about the turn of the millennium, I sort of it started to come on my radar that there was some debate about retirement transitions of older workers. And some of the things wasn't much around at that time, some of the things I read chimed with debates and ideas that were prevalent in the youth transitions literature. And then the Joseph Rowntree Foundation had a stream of funding that they were calling for proposals, which was called something like Transitions After 50. I think it might be called Transitions After 50. And I had a look at what they'd already funded, the work that was going on there. And as a sociologist of work and someone who'd always looked at how organizations recruited, managed, trained, developed, made redundant, etc., their employees, I was very struck by how the literature on retirement really didn't include employing organizations. So it tended to be economists looking at individual variables. So how much does finance affect someone's decision to retire, or health, how much does health condition a decision to retire? A little bit on caring responsibilities, but not so much. So there was that strand of work. And then there was a more social policy, and that was mainly economists doing that kind of work. There was a social policy strand that was interested in how people felt about retirement, their experience in retirement, whether they were poor, whether they had enough money, and if you like, the more kind of community end of retirement. But there really seemed to be almost nobody looking at the employment of older workers. And it struck me as very odd because, of course, people retire from an organization. They don't retire in the abstract. So I thought, well, organizations have got to have some impact on this. Because they have an impact on, people getting jobs and losing jobs and etc. So that was what inspired my application to Rowntree, and I was lucky enough to get that grant in the early 2000s, and which was on, I can't remember what it was called now. I think it was the employers. Trying to look at my bookshelf, remind myself, the employer's role in retirement or something of that sort. And that was case study based. And that's really what started me off. And at that time, back in sort of 2003-04, it was seen as a rather eccentric interest, if I'm honest. When I went to conferences to give a paper, or I was talking to other academics and they said, what are you working on? I'd sort of say, oh, older workers and retirement. And they would sort of glaze over, kind of go, oh, interesting, bye. But of course, within about 5 years, certainly within 10 years, it was about as hot a topic as you could imagine. Governments were extremely interested in why people retired early and what might encourage them to not retire early. And huge numbers of people from all kinds of disciplines started to move into the area.
Yeah, so you're kind of a pioneer in that space, really, because you recognise that lack of research and understanding in that area. Before you carry on, I just wanted to kind of get a better idea as to why you think that it's taken so long to develop good quality research when it comes to, I mean, aging in general, the research isn't great, but also specifically within the labour market.
Well, because I think it's, oh, sorry, Mariska, did you?
No, go.
I think it's because in many ways it's related to ageism. As a society, we worry a lot more about youth transitions than we typically worry about retirement transitions. And the same in the labour market, we're more worried about young and prime age workers and how they're getting on. So I think there is some kind of ageism in that. And I also sort of think that the old traditional idea of retirement was that someone effectively lost their economic value. They ceased working and they sort of no longer counted in the labour market. And of course, once you start to do research in this area, you realise that retirement is a process, not an event. I mean, some people drop off a cliff. They work full tilt until the Friday, they retire. And as people used to say to me, they're dead by the Sunday lunchtime. But they're no longer counted so much in the kind of labour statistics. But as the early work that we did showed, it's a much more complicated set of transitions than that. Some people modify their hours and retire gradually. Some people come in and out of the labour market for a while. Some people go self-employed. There's actually quite a lot of different things going on. So I think it was this general tendency really to sort of feel, well, people retire, they have pensions and they're no longer a labour market concern. And I think also that just generally society finds younger people more interesting than they find older people. And that's been the case throughout all of my research, I would say.
Mariska, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I basically agree that maybe also we had first this shift to early retirement, and that was also related to older workers making space for more younger workers. So that might also have something to do with that. And at some point, there became the question like, okay, but if everyone retires early and we're living longer, to what degree is it still affordable? And maybe older workers should work longer. And then there became much more of a policy interest in older workers as well. And with that, also a research interest.
That's absolutely right. I think that point about early retirement really being the in a sense the sort of aspiration for a lot of people, certainly in sort of white collar and professional and managerial jobs, the expectation that they'd probably retire at 60 at the latest was very prevalent. And of course, it allowed a lot of organisations to fairly painlessly reduce their headcount. So if they needed to sort of trim their workforce, there was probably a group of 55 plus people who, with a bit of pension enhancement, would be quite happy to go. And then, the balance tipped, and that came to be seen as a problem. And indeed, it came to be seen that those people were individually not fulfilling their societal obligation by retiring early. That actually they should stay in work and carry on working for as long as they can. So it really flipped.
Yeah, and it's absolutely fascinating, and there's so many topics of discussion in just that last 2 minutes of discussion, which we could kind of delve into. So this is a bit of I'm going to throw that in there. What do you personally think is an optimal age to retire? So we'll start with you, Mariska.
I'm not sure there is an optimal age to retire. I think that a lot depends on what people want, what the context is that they're in, the type of employment that they're in, the perceived and real opportunities to change if they want to. I think it's related to a lot of different factors, and there is not one optimal retirement age.
Yeah, I'd agree entirely with that. I don't think there's an optimal age that fits everybody. People will have different ideas, and the fact that now in the UK we don't have mandatory retirement ages apart from a few isolated cases, so you cannot be made to retire because you reach 65 or 66, is clearly a good thing, because there are people who want to carry on working. And it was very much unfair and inappropriate that they were forced to retire simply because they reached a certain age. But equally, we know, if you look at health statistics about, the ages at which people start to sort of get chronic illnesses of one sort or another. I mean, I have osteoarthritis, for example. Then that is very variable, and if you've done manual work all your life, or you've had very stressful work, if we think about nurses, very appropriate today, there's certain areas of work which really have or take a toll on your physical and mental health. So if you've been doing those for 30, 40 years, your ability to carry on working may well be prejudiced, and then not being able to retire at 63 or 64, whatever it might be, can be a real problem. And that really is in a sense your question shows one of the problems of policy in this area, that if you have a single chronological age for something, it will always be nothing more than an average, and there will be people on either side of that average that it doesn't suit. I mean, you could say the same for voting ages with young people. There's plenty of 16-year-olds who would probably be very good at voting and would make good decisions. There's probably some 25-year-olds that don't know what the hell is going on. So if you just pick an age, it's never going to fit everybody, and that's tremendously true for state pension ages.
No, yeah, fantastic, and super insightful for things you need to consider when you want to retire, and you're thinking about, okay, what when do I want to retire? I think even as a younger person, it's important to start considering those things. And it's not something that's considered at a younger age, because it is that forgotten group, and it's that kind of, no, let's not talk about that yet. We'll wait a while. So I wanted to kind of move more into the ageism element of your research by first starting off talking about why we group people based on age. And this is a few questions in one. Is this another form of discrimination? And maybe is there a better option for grouping people? So, for example, an over 65 exercise class, or I can't think of something now. But we think, okay, you're 16 to 25, you're in this group, you guys are in this group, and I think it overlaps into the ableism disability research that you guys have done, but please talk much more about that, and I will stop talking because I am not an expert.
Ageism definitely is another way of grouping that comes with certain stereotypes that can lead to discrimination, similar to other groupings on other characteristics that people have. For example, gender, ethnicity, different characteristics. It is a very broad grouping as well. So 50 plus, if you think of that, then 50 to 100, I mean 0 to 50 you wouldn't put in one age group. So it's a very strange grouping as well. But yeah, Sarah, do you have
Yeah, I think, I do an exercise sometimes if I do a talk on age to a sort of non-specialist audience. I will give them sort of a little questionnaire thing, an age profile document to fill out. And instead of it being the standard one, let's say 19 to 25, 25 to 34, something like that, and then 65 plus, I will actually make the lower age bands big. So it might be 19 to 45, 46 to 59, 60 to 70, 70 to 80, whatever. And I'll just say, when you get a chance, please fill that out. And I'll carry on talking. And then I can see people, especially people who are, say, 35, they're looking at this and they're thinking, well, I'm in this group 19 to 44. I mean, what kind of group, what's that? And then eventually someone always goes, can I just ask you about this thing that you've given us to fill out? And of course, it's a very simple way of making the point. Well, you would typically put me in the 65 plus group, which means I'm exactly the same as someone who's 85 or 69 or 102, which is absurd. I'm just pointing out to you that you don't particularly like being in this age group that I've defined as 19 to 44. And it just makes people think, they've never thought about that before. And I think now you can begin to see, certainly over the last 5 years or so, I would say now, those typical age bands that you get in questionnaires or surveys or things, they have started to change. It's much less typical now to see that sort of 65 plus. Also, of course, 65 in the UK context is daft anyway, because the state pension age is 66 now anyway, so 65 plus is completely nuts. So yeah, and those things are important because they communicate, don't they, in a subtle, inarticulate and unarticulated way, that sort of when you get to 65, that's it then, everything over 65 is all the same, there's no differentiation. And we've argued that actually you could say that people become less like each other as they age, because the accumulation of life experiences actually makes them much more various and diverse. Whereas a lot of 19 to 25-year-olds, well, they've been through education, they've started to come into the labour market, they've started having relationships of whatever sort, but, they haven't done so much. So actually, they're rather more like each other in some ways than you would expect, 67-year-olds to be, say. So yeah, I think there's a real danger in that, that we use this, and it's something we wrestle with in our area of research, because older workers are typically defined as being 50 plus. Now, we know from our work that there's actually typically a big difference between the orientation of someone who's 52, their orientation to pension retirement issues, in comparison to someone who's 62. Because the 62-year-old may already have retired or may be closer to it. And I've interviewed over the years many 52-year-olds who will sort of say, oh, retirement, I haven't even thought about it yet. I suppose I should. But yeah, no, I haven't really thought about it. And my pension, yeah, I think it's okay, I don't really know. Whereas sort of a 63, 64-year-old has probably got a bit more of a handle on those things. But then again, it depends on your health, it depends on your finances, your domestic circumstances, whether you're caring for people, your family structure, your community, as to, how old you feel, the significance or otherwise that you attribute to that, and everybody around you attributes to that. So yes, our weddedness to chronological age categories is really part of ageism, I think. And not just ageism against the old, but also ageism against young people as well. The assumption that anyone who's under 19 is sort of young, feckless, doesn't know anything very much.
Naive, yeah. I am going to move on to the next question, which is part of ageism, actually ableism. So before we start, I wanted to get, maybe Mariska, you can potentially do this if you can, or maybe as a team. Can you explain the differences between disability, ableism and impairment?
There are different ways that terms are used, and I don't think for everything there is a complete consensus on how to use all of the terms. How I would distinguish different terms is that the impairment is related to the health condition that someone has. So, for example, I have knee problems, and because of those knee problems, I walk with crutches. And that is an impairment that I have. Disability is much more the problems that arise from a social relational perspective, that's called as an interaction between the environment and an impairment that you may have. So, for example, it's not really an issue if you cannot walk stairs, if there are no stairs around, if there's always an elevator, for example. So it's that interaction, not only the physical interaction, but also with how people are treating people with disability, with an impairment. That's all part of that term disability in that. And then ableism is a term that is used of the normalcy of having an able body, quote unquote able body. That there is this assumption that on which society is built, that assumes that everyone is able to hear to a certain degree, to see to a certain degree, to walk to a certain degree, same cognitive mental functioning to a certain degree. There's this normal, fully human person, again, air quotes there that you will not hear on a podcast, that society is built on. And if there are deviations from that, then that is more difficult to get around because society isn't built around that.
Yep, I'd agree with that. And what I would add is in the work context that a lot of employer policy and a lot of our ideas about recruitment and selection, training, development, career progression, etc., is sort of built around a concept of the ideal worker. And the ideal worker is a prime age worker, probably 25 to 49 maybe. They're male because they don't have any caring responsibilities. They're fully able to come in and devote themselves entirely to their work. And a lot of jobs are framed on the assumption that there is an ideal worker out there already trained, by somebody else, already trained to come in and do that work. Now, when you think about it, actually, it's really probably less than half the working population, much less than half the working population, that fits this ideal worker, type. There's an age group, there's younger people and older people that don't fit it. Lots of women don't fit it because they want or they need to work part-time, or they're juggling other kinds of caring responsibilities. And of course, some men are doing that as well. Then there's a whole raft of us with health conditions or impairments, or, who, are good at some things, not so good at others, a bit disabled by our environments because there's heavy doors that we can't push open and the lift doesn't work, etc. And so on and so on. So, that's in the work context, that's how ableism kind of manifests itself. It sort of manifests itself by the idea or the way in which jobs are framed for a mythical ideal worker.
Yeah, that's a lot of things to think about, I guess, because I would perceive myself as that ideal person, but the fact that it's probably going to be a man, and it's so true, because I run my own business, but if I wanted to go into a job, I am of childbearing age, that would be a massive consideration as to longevity of, is she going to be here, or are we going to have to pay her paternity leave?
Exactly.
So lots to think about there.
And there's a good example of this on retention. This, how long somebody is going to stay with an organisation. And in a lot of organisations, that's not insignificant because it costs quite a lot to recruit somebody. Then there may be a degree of training necessary to get them used to whatever it is they're doing in your specific organisation. So you want to reduce labour turnover. You don't want a kind of constant churn. It's not good really for anything. It costs you money, probably means that your product or your service is not as good as it could be because there's this churn of staff. And it's a very common assumption, do I want to employ this 56-year-old because they might retire, a bit like do I want to employ this woman because she might want to go off and have a baby. But actually, when you look at retention statistics, people who get taken on in jobs in their 50s and even in their 60s tend to stick around. They're very pleased to have been given a job because they know that the labour market is very difficult for older people. So they tend to be a pretty good bet. Whereas, betting on a 25-year-old still being around in 10 years' time, or a 35-year-old or a 45-year-old, is probably somewhat less secure. But again, it's the frame that we bring unconsciously. Here's someone who's probably not going to be around for too long. Or, here's a woman who is perhaps going to have children. Oh, this person's using crutches. Does that mean they're not going to be able to move around? Or they've got some other kind of health issue that I can't see, but that might affect how they're able to work. Instead of actually doing what you should be doing, which is sort of saying, well, who is this person? What skills have they got? What potential have they got? What do they want to give to the organisation? And recruiting them on that basis.
Absolutely. So would you guys be able to summarise your research findings regarding, is part of ageism actually ableism for us? I know that's a big question because you could probably talk about it for ages.
I think the short answer is yes. I do think that part of ageism is ableism. There are a lot of the stereotypes about when we're talking about ageism towards older people. A lot of the stereotypes about older people are related to health issues, and that older people, what's been referred to as the decline narrative, it will all get worse. So the physical health will go down, the mental health will go down, the cognitive health will go down. And a lot of the assumptions based on that, stereotypes based on that, if there were no ableism, then probably older workers would also be less affected by them. So if it wasn't the assumption or that it will all be downhill if the people were having health issues, if the workforce was more designed for people with health issues, then it would be less an issue for everyone, including older people, and the stereotypes would matter less. Do we think that all of ageism is ableism? No, that's also not true. We looked at different layers of ageism, Sarah and I, and we also hear a lot about what we've been calling the too old for narrative, that people felt that they were now too old to go for training or too old now to go for a promotion. Or if there's scarce resources, what we called, help me here, Sarah.
Intergenerational disentitlement.
Thank you. Where people would talk of the resources are scarce, who should it go to? Well, maybe you should go to the younger person. And that if there's little resource for training, let's give it to the younger person because they still have, again, quote unquote, a career that they need to build there.
Yeah, I think, and just to add to what Mariska has said, I think that what we're trying to say in this research has been that, yes, we need to focus on the discrimination that people experience, discrimination against people not being offered a job because of their age, not even getting through to an interview because of their age, not being offered a training opportunity, not being considered for a promotion. That happens, and we need to acknowledge that and indeed deal with it and attempt to change that situation. But at the same time, this kind of decline narrative, you know, that as we age, everything sort of gets grimmer, really, health and everything, is something that we also internalize. So, you know, when people say things like, oh, I'm having a senior moment. Well, everybody forgets things, actually, you know, and a 30-year-old wouldn't kind of go, oh, I'm having a senior moment. We're kind of internalizing and buying into that. So as well as being discriminated against, we may actually limit ourselves and sort of say, well, I won't go for that job promotion because probably they want someone who's younger.
And I'm too old.
Yeah, they'll just think, you know, oh well, she's going out the door soon. We won't promote her. But also that people worry about, you know, that decline narrative. You know, I'm fine. We've had people say this to us in research so often, haven't we, Mariska? Well, I'm fine. My health's fine, but you know, how long will it last? I'm worried, you know, that I'm perhaps not as quick as I used to be.
An expectation that your health is going to decline. It's like inevitable.
Inevitable.
It's not true.
Just round the corner, you know, and also this, I think that the intergenerational point is really important because, of course, you know, when we're interviewing people in their 50s and 60s and 70s, they typically do have families. You know, they have children and they have perhaps grandchildren, and they do see them having challenges in the labour market because a lot of people have challenges in the labour market throughout their working histories. And they do sort of think to themselves, well, you know, if there's a limited number of jobs, perhaps those jobs should go to young people rather than to me. And if I stay in my job, am I denying a younger person an opportunity? But of course, the labour market isn't really a fixed number of jobs like that. If you look at countries where, you know, if you look at somewhere like Norway or Iceland or other Scandinavian countries where people do tend to carry on working into their late 60s in higher numbers, you find that also there's not much youth unemployment. You know, it's a good economy, it's a buoyant economy, and therefore employment opportunities are good for everyone. Where you find high youth unemployment, you tend to also find high older unemployment. So, but it's a very, very strongly held belief. I mean, you know, in every project I've done in the last 20 odd years, there have always been people sort of saying, well, you know, I do worry that if I want to carry on working, but I worry if I do, I'm denying someone else younger a job. And they're thinking about their kids and their grandkids or their, you know, their nephews or their nieces or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I actually have a client that I work with who has just retired, who, I mean, he wasn't forced out. He's been working there for, I think, maybe 50 years. But they basically said to him, like, you need to go because we need to make way for other ambitious people in the company to take your position. So it's, I mean, I can see the negatives and the positives in that element that he probably needed that push to try something else because I think otherwise he would never have retired. Because it's like a crutch in a sense. But then also that's an element of ageism where it's like he's able to do his job as well as anybody else. Is that morally right to make him decide to leave? So I think it would be a really interesting case study for people to look into as an individual, but also from a business perspective, and
looking at how we should deal with those scenarios in the future. But we're kind
of saying that it's a crush and he needed to push, but did he? If he liked his job and he wanted to stay in the job, why not?
And that's it. It's like, why not stay in the job? But when would you leave? I don't know. And
do you need to leave?
Well, maybe we work till the end of life.
It's ultimately a capability issue, isn't it? And we've done some work with train companies in the past, and they're interesting because it's a safety critical environment. They have very good data on the performance of their train drivers, for example, which is good news for us as passengers. But what that data tells them is that there are bad train drivers at 25, 35, 45, 55 and 65. And there are great train drivers at 25, 35, 45, etc. The age doesn't actually tell them whether someone's a good train driver or not. Some people are better than others. So, I mean, in your case that you've just given, I mean, if the person was still doing their job as well as the organisation needed them to do it, then there really isn't any justification for having pushed them out. If the person was beginning not to perform as well, then they should have been managing that and not using age as the excuse to kind of nudge them out. They should have been sort of saying, well, let's talk about your performance because we've got some issues. Are there things that would help you, improve? Can we do something, or whatever? And that's true for a 65-year-old, 55-year-old, 45-year-old, etc. Sometimes people aren't doing very well in the job that they're in. They should be given an opportunity, the training or development or mentoring or whatever it is to improve. And if they aren't able to improve, then it may be the case that they need to be encouraged to move on. But that shouldn't be anything to do with their age. It should be to do, or their gender or any other characteristic they may have. It should be to do with their ability to do the job. And of course, it may be that the way the job's framed is not right. Going back to that ideal worker point, that we have this notion we've got to wedge people into pre-existing jobs, whereas sometimes actually you could change the job and the person might be even more productive in the job if you modified it slightly. It's just we tend to have this, well, this is the job, can you fit it? Rather than this person's great and has got a lot of potential, what kind of job could we give them?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, that's your expertise, isn't it? Employability and things like that. So anyone listening, take that and deal with it. Okay, so we're just going to finish up, but to finish up, I'm going to get you guys to think of one key takeaway from your research that we could implement in a real life scenario.
One of the sort of odd effects of the changes that have been around age discrimination legislation and no mandatory retirement ages is that organisations have stopped talking to people about retirement because they fear that if they talk to someone about retirement, that will somehow be ageist. And of course, you could talk to someone about retirement in a way that would be ageist, the case that you gave. But I think what that means is that at all points in people's careers, there should be opportunities through appraisals or whatever systems exist for people to talk about how they feel they're doing, for their line manager to reflect on how they think they're doing and to contemplate whether they're looking to move to the next promotion point or they'd like to do something slightly different. And if we had better habits in talking to people about their work on a regular basis, quite a lot of issues around performance would get dealt with before they became a real problem. And people would feel able to talk to their line managers. Well, yeah, I think I think I will retire in a year or so or a couple of years. At the moment, everyone is scared to talk about retirement because the manager thinks they'll be accused of ageism. And the person who's thinking about retiring thinks, if I say I think I want to retire in 2 years' time, they'll write me off. And I won't get any other opportunities in the next 2 years because I think, oh, well, they're going, so we don't need to bother about them. So, yeah, we've got to try and deal with that.
Brilliant. Great impact feedback for anyone who is looking at policy within their company and discussing retirement. I think that's great because, I mean, as somebody who's growing a business, I think for me, it's something I need to consider for myself. Like I keep toying with the idea of having a pension plan and things like that.
Do it now. And
I did look into it, and I've had meetings with financial advisors and things like that. But there's also an element of like, it's not urgent, but I know I should do it now because it's going to be fantastic in the future the sooner I start. So
I always say to my students, when they're going for interviews, when they're, about to graduate or whatever, and they're going, especially if they're going to big corporates, they'll ask me, have I got any questions? What questions should I ask? And I have said for the last 20 years, I've said, ask them about the pension. And the student always goes, no, I can't ask them about the pension. and you say, why not? It'd be a really good question. And they'd think you were really smart.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll probably be the first time that anybody had asked that question in an interview.
Exactly. But I don't know whether any of them ever did. Just maybe one or two, probably.
How about you, Mariska?
Yeah, I think an implication for me is to think through when it's about age and when it's about perceived or thought or real ability. Because I think it does lead to different changes in an organization as well. If it is about age discrimination or age stereotypes, then the solution is probably different than when it's actually about hidden ableism in there. And I think that needs to be acknowledged more and looked at, because if we're thinking about it's about age and solutions are about age, it won't solve it if it's actually about ableism.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, and thank you so much for spending your time talking to us about all of these amazing and important aspects of ageism. If people wanted to find out more about the research, we will definitely include a link in the show notes. But if you guys had any specific areas, if anyone had a question for you, how would be the best place for social media to contact you?
Social media for me, Twitter is probably the best.
Likewise.
Okay, so Twitter, and then what will your handles be? We'll also include that in the show notes.
Put in show notes, but it's at Mariska Horst.
I need to look mine up.
And Vickerstaff is at Vickerstaff S.
Yes, that's it.
You should employ her as your PA.
That's the
there
one.
You go, Mariska. You got another job. Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys.
Okay, enjoy talking to you.
Yeah.